On a warm September morning in 1066, the green fields of Yorkshire bore witness to something extraordinary. Not just another medieval battle, but the violent end of an entire age. Here, beside a narrow stone bridge, the dreams of conquest that had driven Norse warriors across the seas for 3 centuries would finally shatter against English steel. This was the day the Viking Age died. The story begins not with the clash of swords, but with the death of a king. When Edward the Confessor drew his final breath in January 1066, he left behind more than just an empty throne. He left behind a web of promises, claims, and ambitions that would soon drench England in blood. 3 men believed they had the right to wear the crown of England, and each was prepared to kill for it. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, claimed Edward had promised him the throne on his deathbed. William of Normandy insisted Edward had sworn years earlier to make him heir, but there was a third claimant, one whose very name struck fear into the hearts of those who heard it whispered across the North Sea: Harald Sigurdsson, known as Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north. Harald Hardrada was no ordinary king. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with hands like sledgehammers and a presence that seemed to fill any room he entered, he was the living embodiment of Viking power. His life read like something from the sagas themselves. As a teenager, he had fled Norway after his half-brother fell in battle, spending 15 years as an exile and mercenary. He fought in the deserts of the Holy Land, commanded armies in Sicily, and rose to lead the legendary Varangian Guard in Constantinople, the elite warriors who protected the Byzantine emperor himself. By the time he claimed the throne of Norway in 1046, Harald had accumulated a fortune in gold and a reputation that stretched from the fjords of Scandinavia to the palaces of the Mediterranean. He was, in every sense, the last great Viking king. And like every Viking before him, his eyes turned westward to the green shores of England. Harold's claim to the English throne was based on more than mere ambition. Years earlier, the Danish king Harthacnut, who had ruled both Denmark and England, had promised his kingdoms to Magnus of Norway upon his death. When Harthacnut died, it was Edward the Confessor, not Magnus, who took the English crown. But Harald, as Magnus's successor, believed that promise still held. In his mind, England was his by right. The moment Edward died, Harald began preparing for war. But he would not sail alone. Fate delivered him an unexpected ally in the form of Tostig Godwinson, the brother of the new English King Harold. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria, but his harsh rule had sparked rebellion. When his own brother refused to restore him, Tostig fled to Norway, burning with the desire for revenge. The alliance between Harald and Tostig was perfect in its mutual hatred. Harald wanted a crown. Tostig wanted vengeance against his brother. Together they would bring the largest invasion fleet Norway had ever assembled to English shores. Through the summer of 1066, the fjords of Norway echoed with the sound of preparation. Shipwrights worked day and night, crafting the sleek longships that would carry Harold's army across the North Sea. Blacksmiths forged weapons and armor. Warriors sharpened axes and tested the draw of their bows. This would not be a raid for silver and slaves. This would be conquest. The fleet that assembled was staggering in its size. Over 300 ships stretched across the harbor, their dragonhead prows carved with snarling beasts and ravens, the traditional symbols of Odin's warriors. Between 7,000 and 9,000 men filled those vessels, the largest army Norway had fielded in generations. Veterans of campaigns across Europe stood alongside eager young warriors, seeking their first taste of battle and glory. At the head of this vast armada stood Harold himself, his personal banner, the famous Landwaster, rippling in the wind. The banner's very name struck fear into enemies. Wherever it flew, it was said, the land would be laid waste. Harald had carried it through victories across the known world. Now it would lead the last great Viking invasion of England. The crossing was swift and merciless. The Norwegian fleet swept down the English coast like a storm, striking terror into coastal settlements. Villages emptied at the sight of the dragon ships. Smoke rose from burning farms and churches. The Vikings had returned, and they had come not to raid, but to conquer. Harold's first target was the great city of York, the jewel of northern England. But to reach York, he would have to defeat the earls who controlled the north. Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, brothers and the most powerful nobles in the region, gathered their forces to meet the invaders. On September 20th, 1066, the two armies met at Fulford Gate, just outside York. The battle was brutal and decisive. The English fought bravely, but they faced warriors hardened by decades of war. Harold's veterans formed their shield wall and advanced like an unstoppable tide. The English line bent, cracked, and finally shattered. Edwin and Morcar fled the field, leaving hundreds of their men dead in the marshes. York, faced with the prospect of siege by an overwhelming force, chose surrender over destruction. The gates swung open, and Harold Hardrada strode through the streets of England's second city as a conqueror. The citizens watched in silence as the tall Norwegian king claimed their city in the name of his crown. But Harold was no mere destroyer. He understood that lasting conquest required more than fear. He offered the Northumbrians terms: submit to his rule, provide hostages and supplies, and they would be spared further violence. The city agreed, and Harold withdrew to his ships at Rickle, confident that his conquest was proceeding according to plan. In the warm September sun, the Norwegian army relaxed. Many left their heavy mail shirts aboard the ships. After all, they had just crushed the northern earls. York had surrendered without a fight. The next phase would be a simple matter of collecting hostages and consolidating control before marching south to claim the rest of England. Harold had every reason for confidence. His invasion had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. The northern defenses had crumbled. England's second city was his. The road south lay open. In his mind, the crown of England was already within his grasp. But Harold had made a critical miscalculation. He believed Harold Godwinson was still in the south, watching the coasts for William of Normandy. He could not know that even as he celebrated in York, the English king was already racing north with his army, covering impossible distances in a desperate march to save his kingdom. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through the ages. Two Harolds, two armies, and the fate of England itself would be decided in a place called Stamford Bridge. What happened there would not just determine who ruled England, it would bring down the final curtain on the Viking Age itself. The morning of September 25th dawned hot and still over the Yorkshire countryside. The kind of day where armor becomes a furnace and mail shirts feel like lead weights dragging at a warrior's shoulders. For the Norwegians camped near Stamford Bridge, it seemed like a perfect day to conduct the mundane business of empire. They were here to collect hostages from the surrounding villages, a routine task that required little more than an intimidating presence and sharp weapons. Harold Hardrada rode among his men with the casual confidence of a king who believed his greatest battles were behind him. The defeat at Fulford had broken northern resistance. York lay in his hands. The English king was surely still hundreds of miles away, watching empty seas for Norman sails. This was meant to be a day of administration, not warfare. Many of the Norwegian warriors had left their heavy armor back with the ships at Rickle, 12 miles downstream. The September heat made steel and leather unbearable, and there seemed no immediate need for such precautions. Some wore only tunics and carried just their weapons. Others lounged by the river, enjoying what felt like the calm after the storm. But storms have a way of appearing when least expected. The first sign of trouble came from the western horizon. A smudge of dust, barely visible at first, growing larger with each passing moment. Then came the sound, faint but unmistakable to experienced ears, the rhythm of marching feet, the jingle of mail, the snort of war horses. An army was approaching, and it was moving fast. Harold's scouts came thundering back with news that shattered the morning calm. The English were coming. Not just any English force, but Harold Godwinson himself, at the head of his royal army. Thousands of warriors, their banners streaming in the wind, advancing with the terrible purpose of men who had marched day and night to reach this moment. The Norwegian king felt the first cold touch of genuine surprise. How was this possible? Harold should have been in the south, guarding against Norman invasion. The journey from London to Yorkshire was nearly 200 miles of rough roads and difficult terrain. No army should have been able to cover such distance so quickly. But Harold Godwinson had achieved the impossible. In 4 days, his force had raced across England, gathering reinforcements along the way. His housecarls, the elite warriors who formed the backbone of the English army, had endured a march that would have broken lesser men. They came with the fury of defenders fighting for their homeland, and they came with the advantage of complete surprise. Panic rippled through the Norwegian camp. Warriors scrambled for weapons and shields. Commands were shouted in Norse and English, as Tostig's men tried to form ranks alongside Harold's veterans. But there was no time for proper preparation. The English army was already visible, pouring down the hillside like a steel avalanche. Harald Hardrada had faced armies before. He had fought in the desert heat of Syria and the mountain passes of Sicily. He had stood in the shield wall at Byzantium and led charges across the battlefields of Europe. But this was different. This was an enemy that had appeared as if conjured by sorcery, catching his forces dispersed and unprepared. The river Derwent ran between the two armies, crossed by a narrow wooden bridge. It was here that the fate of two kingdoms would be decided. Harold quickly grasped the tactical situation. The bridge was a choke point, a place where numbers mattered less than courage and skill. If his men could hold that crossing, they might buy time for reinforcements to arrive from the ships. But first, there came a moment that would echo through legend. As the two armies faced each other across the water, a lone English rider approached the Norwegian lines. He called out in a voice that carried across the field, asking to speak with Harald Hardrada. When the towering Norwegian king rode forward to meet him, the Englishman delivered an offer that was both generous and insulting. King Harold would grant Tostig his old earldom back, restoring him to his former position in Northumbria. There would be peace between the brothers. "And what will my ally Harold of Norway receive?" the great king asked. The English rider's answer would become the stuff of saga and song. 7 feet of English ground, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. As he is taller than other men, perhaps a little more. The insult hung in the air like the scent of smoke before a great fire. Harald Hardrada had been offered nothing but a grave, and the messenger had delivered the threat with the casual confidence of a man certain of victory. When the rider wheeled his horse and galloped back toward the English lines, both armies knew that words were finished. Now there would be only steel and blood. Harold turned to his men and saw something he had rarely encountered in his long career. Uncertainty flickered in the eyes of veterans who had followed him across the world. They were outnumbered, caught without proper armor, separated from their ships and supplies. The odds that had seemed so favorable just hours before had shifted dramatically against them. But Harald Hardrada was not called the Thunderbolt of the North for nothing. His voice boomed across the ranks as he rallied his warriors. They were Vikings, he reminded them. They were the sons of men who had terrorized Europe for 3 centuries. They had come to claim a crown, and they would not be turned back by threats or disadvantage. The Norwegian shield wall formed on the eastern bank of the Derwent, a bristling line of overlapping shields and protruding spear points. Behind them stood archers with their bows drawn. To their flanks, the few mounted warriors who had brought their horses prepared for a cavalry charge that might break the English advance. On the western bank, Harold Godwinson's army deployed with the precision of a force that had trained together for years. The king's housecarls formed the center, their great Danish axes glinting in the sunlight. To either side, the furred levies from the shires took their positions, farmers and craftsmen who had answered their king's call to arms. Between the two armies lay the bridge, narrow enough that only a few men could cross at once. It would become the focal point of everything that followed, the place where the dreams of kings would live or die. The first English warriors to attempt the crossing moved with careful determination. They knew they faced desperate men fighting for their lives, and desperate men were always the most dangerous. Shields locked together, spears thrust forward, they stepped onto the wooden planks that spanned the dark water below. What happened next would be remembered as long as men told stories of battle and heroism. A single Norwegian warrior stepped forward onto the bridge. He was massive even by Viking standards, carrying a 2-handed battle axe that seemed to gleam with its own inner light. His mail shirt caught the morning sun as he planted himself squarely in the center of the narrow crossing, and his voice rang out across the water with a challenge that needed no translation. He would hold the bridge alone. Let the English come and test themselves against him. What followed was a display of martial prowess that belonged more to legend than to the brutal reality of medieval warfare. Wave after wave of English warriors charged across the bridge, only to meet the whistling arc of that great axe. Steel bit deep into shields and helms. Bodies tumbled from the narrow planks into the river below. The lone Viking seemed less a man than a force of nature, an immovable object that turned the bridge into a killing ground. For nearly an hour he held his post. Dozens of England's finest warriors fell to his blade, their blood staining the wooden planks beneath his feet. The English advance ground to a halt as men began to whisper that they faced not a mortal warrior, but some avatar of the old gods, sent to protect the Viking host. But mortal he was, and mortal he would prove to be. While the giant held the attention of the English front ranks, a clever Saxon warrior slipped beneath the bridge in a small boat. Working his way through the supports, he found a gap in the planking and thrust his spear upward with all his strength. The great Viking's roar of pain and fury echoed across the battlefield as he crashed to his knees, then toppled forward into the dark water. The bridge was clear, and the English army poured across like a dam bursting. Harald Hardrada met them on the eastern bank, with his shield wall intact. The collision was thunderous, a crash of wood and iron that could be heard for miles. Spears shattered against shields, axes bit deep into mail. Men grappled and fell, their blood soaking into the Yorkshire earth. But the Norwegians were fighting without their full strength. Too many had left their armor behind. Too many were still making their way back from the ships at recall. What should have been an unstoppable Viking war machine was instead a desperate band of warriors making their last stand on foreign soil. Harold himself fought in the front rank, his great height making him impossible to miss. His sword rose and fell with mechanical precision, cutting down English warriors who pressed too close. Around him, his personal guard fought with the fury of men who knew their king's life hung in the balance. For a time, it seemed the Norwegian line might hold. Their shield wall bent, but did not break. Their axes found English flesh, as often as English steel found theirs. The battle swayed back and forth along the riverbank like some deadly dance, neither side able to claim decisive advantage. Then came the moment that changed everything. An English archer, perhaps stationed on higher ground, drew his bow and let fly. The arrow rose in a high arc before plunging down toward the Norwegian ranks. It found the one gap in Harald Hardrada's defenses, slipping beneath his raised shield to pierce his throat. The great king staggered, his hand flying to the wound as blood poured between his fingers. For a heartbeat, the battle seemed to pause as warriors on both sides realized what had happened. Then Harald Hardrada, the thunderbolt of the north, the last great Viking king, fell forward onto his shield and moved no more. The effect on his army was immediate and devastating. The shield wall wavered as men looked back to see their king's banner falling. Panic began to spread through the ranks like wildfire. Some warriors broke immediately, fleeing toward the ships. Others fought on with the desperate fury of men who knew they would never see their homeland again. Tostig Godwinson, Harold's English ally, tried to rally the survivors. He called out to his countrymen in the English ranks, offering to negotiate, perhaps hoping his royal blood might yet buy him mercy. But Harold Godwinson's answer was swift and final. There would be no quarter for traitors, no mercy for those who brought foreign invaders to English soil. Tostig fell soon after, cut down in the press of battle, as the Norwegian resistance finally collapsed. With both their leaders dead, the surviving Vikings streamed away from the battlefield in complete disorder. Some made it to the ships at recall, many did not. The pursuit was relentless and merciless. English cavalry rode down fleeing Norwegians as they struggled through the Yorkshire countryside. Men who had survived the bloodiest battlefields of Europe fell to English spears miles from where their king had died. The river Derwent ran red with the blood of two peoples, but it was mostly Norwegian blood that stained its waters. Even as the main battle ended, late arrivals from the Norwegian fleet provided one last moment of drama. Eystein Orre, Harold's prospective son-in-law, had raced from the ships with several hundred men upon hearing the sounds of battle. They arrived to find their king dead and their army scattered, but they formed up anyway for one final charge. What followed was remembered in the sagas as Orre's Storm, a last desperate assault by men who chose death over the shame of retreat. They struck the English line with such ferocity that for a moment it seemed they might yet turn the tide. but they were too few and too late. The storm broke against English shields, and Eystein Orre joined his king among the slain. By evening, the field of Stamford Bridge was silent, except for the groans of the wounded and the cries of carrion birds gathering for their feast. The greatest invasion fleet Norway had ever assembled was broken beyond repair. Of the 300 ships that had carried Harold's army to England, only 24 would be needed to carry the survivors home. The dream of a North Sea empire ruled from Trondheim was over. Never again would dragon ships darken English waters in such numbers. Never again would a Norwegian king claim the crown of England by right of conquest. The Viking Age, which had begun with raids on Lindisfarne nearly 3 centuries before, had ended on a bloody field in Yorkshire. But even as Harold Godwinson celebrated his greatest victory, fate was preparing its cruelest irony. 3 days after Stamford Bridge, Norman ships appeared off the southern coast. William the Conqueror had finally come, and Harold would have to march his exhausted army south to face a fresh enemy. The victory that should have secured his throne would instead lead directly to his doom, and England would fall not to Vikings but to Normans, who were themselves descended from Viking raiders. The weight of Harald Hardrada's death rippled outward from that blood-soaked field like stones thrown into still water. In the immediate aftermath, as English warriors stripped armor from Norwegian corpses and tended to their own wounded, few could have grasped the true magnitude of what had just occurred. This was not merely the defeat of another ambitious king or the failure of yet another invasion. This was the moment when an entire way of life, a culture of conquest that had shaped Europe for 3 centuries, breathed its last. The survivors who limped back to the ships at Rickle carried more than just their wounds. They bore the crushing knowledge that they had witnessed the end of something that had seemed eternal. The great longships that had once struck terror into coastal settlements across Europe now seemed like relics of a bygone age. The carved dragon heads that had snarled defiance at countless enemies appeared suddenly toothless, their menace broken along with the dreams of their crews. Word of the disaster spread across the North Sea faster than the surviving ships could carry it. In the halls of Norwegian jarls, the news struck like a physical blow. Harald Hardrada, the giant who had seemed invincible, was dead. The army that was supposed to restore the glories of Canute's empire had been annihilated by English farmers and craftsmen. The shock reverberated through every fjord and settlement where Norse was spoken. But the true significance of Stamford Bridge extended far beyond the borders of any single kingdom. For nearly 300 years, the sight of dragon-proud ships on the horizon had been a source of terror from Ireland to Constantinople. Viking raiders had carved out kingdoms in England, established settlements in Iceland and Greenland, founded cities in Ireland and Russia, and served as elite guards to the Byzantine emperor himself. Their influence had reshaped the political map of medieval Europe. Now that age was over. The defeat had shattered more than just Harold's army. It had broken the psychological foundation upon which Viking expansion rested. The aura of invincibility that had allowed relatively small bands of Norse warriors to terrorize much larger populations was gone forever. Future generations of Scandinavian leaders would look not westward toward conquest, but inward toward consolidation and defense. The Battle of Stamford Bridge had proven that the military innovations that once gave Vikings their edge had been surpassed. The longship, that marvel of medieval naval technology that could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, had met its match in the organized infantry and cavalry of established kingdoms. The berserker fury that had once broken enemy lines was no match for disciplined troops fighting on their home ground with superior numbers and preparation. The echoes of that September day would resonate through the halls of history long after the last survivor had sailed home to Norway. At Stamford Bridge, Harald Hardrada had not merely lost a battle or forfeited a crown. He had closed the final chapter of the Viking Age itself. The dragon ships would still prowl the northern seas, but never again would they carry the dreams of empire. Never again would the sight of their sails on the horizon herald the coming of conquest. The age of the longship had ended, and with it, 3 centuries of Norse dominance over the waters of Europe. In the space of a single day, the Viking dream of conquest had been buried forever in the Yorkshire earth.